Morning, everybody. Thanks, Catherine, for hosting this event here today and for making us all tell you about our experiences of open science and open scholarship, and also making us all really nervous. So apologies for the wavering voice. So I'm the Institutional Repository Manager at University College Cork Library. So I suppose my expertise really and my experiences are around open access, but I'm going to attempt to explain open science and open scholarship to you today. So in the tradition of the best Leaving Cert essays, I'm going to start with a definition. And I'm going to read it out. So open science is the practice of science in such a way that others can collaborate and contribute, where research data, lab notes and other research processes are freely available, under terms that enable reuse, redistribution and reproduction of the research and its underlying data and methods. And that definition is taken from the Foster Open Science Project. And they have a wealth of resources around open science because they're supporting the European Commission move towards open science and bringing Europe to the forefront of that advance. So I suppose I have to point out that even though I've used science and open science in this definition, it is worth mentioning that open science is something that has been roughly translated from the German word Wissenschaft. So in the German language, Wissenschaft denotes something much broader than science and technology. And it includes every systematic academic study of any area. So in English, it's maybe translates better to open scholarship. So that's why we had open scholarship in the title of our seminar. There hasn't because it is more inclusive of all disciplines, principles and practices. And it is probably why Trinity College Dublin, for example, have named their internal group looking at this movement the TCD Open Scholarship Task Force. But of course, open science and open scholarship are often more broadly referred to as open research. So it doesn't really help, I suppose, clear things up, but just to be aware that when people are talking about open scholarship, open research and open science, they are very much, I suppose, the same thing. But admittedly, open science is something that does seem to be winning the nomenclature battle because the European Commission are pushing it forward, and I suppose we are very much trying to align ourselves with European policies. So open science, I suppose there's 4 fundamental things to remember, and if that's all you take away from today, then that's fantastic. It has to be transparent, it has to be accessible, and it has to be available and free. And it refers, I suppose, to doing traditional science with more transparency involved than previously was possible, really, because of the advent of the internet technologies, and and that has made things vastly more accessible. I suppose I was thinking about how librarians are probably already used to this idea of open science when you look at the the idea of the union catalogue and sharing catalogue records and working to standards that other people understand. And we understand the benefits of doing that because we can pool our resources, that we're limiting wasted effort and wasted resources. And because those catalogues are available online, you can check things right across the world. So that's just very fundamentally what open science is about. However, it is something of a spectrum. There's lots of different aspects to it. I have 12 things listed here, and these are taken from the Foster Open Science Training Handbook. And I'm going to go through these today, trying to give you, I suppose, an outline of these components. But they, I suppose, encompass various practices, principles and communities, but they all fall under that open science umbrella. None of them maybe are strictly defined, and they don't always apply to every aspect of research. But they are, again, just to remember when you're looking at, I suppose, open science across all disciplines. So if we start off with open concepts and principles, I suppose, where did the whole concept of open science come from? Well, it is based on the principles of inclusion, fairness, equity and sharing, and ultimately seeks to change the way that research is done, who is involved in it and how it is valued. So it aims to make research more open to participation, to review, to improvement and for reuse for the whole world to benefit. And the concepts and principles underlying the push to implement the various practices around open science were analysed by Fetcher and Frisk, and they, I suppose, categorise them into 5 schools of thought that I've listed there. So we have the democratic school, and anybody working in open access will be familiar with, I suppose, this concept that we believe that there is an unequal distribution of the access to knowledge. This area is concerned with making scholarly knowledge, including publications and data, available freely for all to access. The pragmatic school, following the principle that the creation of knowledge is made more efficient through collaboration and strengthened through critique. This area seeks to harness network effects by connecting scholars and making scholarly methods transparent. The infrastructure school is motivated by the assumption that effective research requires readily available platforms, tools and services for dissemination and collaboration. And the public school is based on the recognition that the true societal impact requires societal engagement in research and readily understandable communication of scientific results. So this aims to bring the public to collaborate in research through citizen science and make scholarship more readily understandable through lay summaries, blogging or other less formal communication methods. And then finally we have the measurement school. And motivations here, I suppose, are around the acknowledgement that traditional metrics for measuring scientific impact or the impact of research have proven problematic because they are often very heavily focused on publications like journal level metrics instead of maybe article level metrics or individual researcher metrics. So this strand is looking for alternative metrics which can make use of new possibilities of digitally network tools to track and measure the impact of scholarship through formally invisible activities. So greater, I suppose, transparency around how research is evaluated. So there are the, I suppose, various principles which have given rise to this movement towards open science. And it is important to remember that it's not something that's going to be defined and stay static. It'll continue to develop over time. So I'm going to talk about open research data and materials, and it is something that's been very topical for a few years, so probably very familiar with the idea of open research data at this stage. But it's basically data that can be freely accessed, reused, mixed and redistributed for academic research and teaching purposes and beyond that. Ideally, it should have no restrictions on reuse or redistribution and should be licensed as such. However, of course, you know that there are sensitive materials, maybe materials that or data that you want to protect the identity of human subjects or biological subjects. So you have to set special or limited restrictions of access on these types of data. So not every research data, it's not appropriate to make everything open. And the rule of thumb in those cases is that you try to make it as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So we have the concept of sharing open data, that's a good thing, but it's not enough in itself. It also has to follow the fair data principles so that the data is findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And because that will optimise the reusability of the research data. And Fran and Aoife are going to talk about research data because they're actively working in that area now in libraries at UCC and DCU. So other practices that make data open include things like publishing data. So this includes things like adding supplementary files to the journal article so that you can see the results, how they were calculated maybe, or what results they achieved when they followed the methodology described in their journal article. It can also include things like journals who just completely publish data. Additionally, I suppose increasingly now you're seeing researchers linking off to data repositories when in their publications. So not just leaving them on the journal publishers platform, but leaving them in secure repositories so that that data underlying the publications is available for inspection and for further reuse. Also could look at data packaging, and these are containers for describing and sharing accompanying data files, and typically they comprise a metadata file describing the features and context of a data set. And with, I suppose, appropriate data management planning, the metadata can almost always be shared around data. And then it's not just data also that can be shared. You can, I suppose, see scientists sharing reagents and protocols and software, hardware and lab notebooks. And these also support the reusability of data and the reproducibility of science. Sorry. Another aspect of open science, open research software and open source software. Again, something that you're probably all familiar with, the advantages of open source software versus closed source software. So it refers to the use and development of software for analysis, simulation, visualization, where the full source code is available. And in addition, open source software must be distributed in source or compiled form. It's compatible maybe with existing platforms, it's licensed appropriately and has liberal reuse conditions that allow maybe modification, derivation and redistribution so that others can build on the software for their own purposes. And I suppose one tool that is very popular, maybe you've heard of GitHub, and it's a popular tool for developing software because it allows version control, management and overall tracking of changes in a particular piece of software. And then what I suppose you're seeing as well is you have this tool for managing the development of software, but that tool is also integrated with other platforms, and it just ensures that it's easier to maintain, share and collaborate on research software. So just going to move on to talk, I suppose, about reproducibility. And for me, I think when I look at open science, aside from open access, I think the reproducibility crisis in science is one of the most compelling reasons to move towards open science. So it is often, I suppose, reported that science is in the midst of a crisis because a surprising portion of published studies fail to replicate when the procedures are repeated by other scientists. So there's been a lot of work done over around this. There was a reproducibility project in psychology, which was a collaboration of 270 psychologists, and they attempted to replicate 100 psychology studies. But they found that more than half of those failed to replicate. They weren't able to reproduce or to get the same results by doing the same experiments or the same studies. And even when they were able to replicate the studies, they found that their findings weren't as strong as those reported in the original study. A survey of scientists, I think over 1,500 scientists, found that over 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another's scientists' experiments, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. So there can be a whole raft of reasons for this failure of reproducibility, but I suppose most scientists would say that it's not evidence of fraudulent activity in science. It has arisen because of a number, I suppose, of questionable research practices, and these could give rise to reproducibility issues. So there can be things like where you have a research project that could be adequately reported maybe in one paper, but it's sliced into multiple papers and it dilutes the effect of and the impact of that research. There's the publication bias where negative results are often omitted, or null hypotheses are not reported in the literature because journals prefer to report on positive results. You have weak experimental design, where methodological flaws have been observed in published papers. Obviously, we're all human. There's going to be errors in papers as well, maybe computational errors in the reporting of experiments and so on. And also, I suppose a common issue on this is something that is resolved very easily, is around the underspecified methods, where there just simply isn't enough information in a journal article to repeat the study. And any of you with statistical mind frames will know that a lot of studies are statistically weak studies, that they're not robust enough. And then you have underpowered studies where the sample size has been too small to produce reliable results when studies are replicated. So how do you resolve this reproducibility crisis? Well, through open science, you look at the responsible conduct of research, you educate your researchers in research integrity, so that others are available, other results are available to the same people, and the same results can be reproduced by researchers. Researchers should plan for reproducibility at the start of their projects, because it's something that is quite hard to build in afterwards. So if you can improve the reproducibility, it leads to increased rigour and quality of scientific outputs, and thus to greater trust in science. So they have come with their own set of challenges, because it can be difficult to design integrated workflows that can be adopted by collaborators while maintaining high standards of integrity. Open access to published research results. This is something that we're probably all very familiar with in the library world, and Michael is going to talk about later. But open access to publication means that research publications like articles and books can be accessed online free of charge by any user with no technical obstacles. It can be achieved through self-archiving in repositories or publishing in open access venues, either individual articles or on open access journals or publishing platforms. What is, I suppose, increasingly happening now is maybe the advent of archiving, or the increased archiving of preprints in disciplinary repositories. So it was started off by the physics repository archive, but we're seeing new preprints archives emerging in biological science, biomedical sciences, and so on. And these are an opportunity for scientists to get their results out very quickly, and also to get feedback very early on in the publication process, and also to establish priority over a particular research area. Open licensing and file formats. So these are essential, I suppose, if you want to encourage the reuse of anything that you do in your research project. And it is important that researchers define copyright and the related rights for the outputs of research. And one of the easiest ways, and maybe the most familiar ways, to apply Creative Commons licensing. But also important to explain, I suppose, what that means. And that's why Creative Commons have their machine readable license, but also their human readable license. Makes it easier to end users to understand. We also have collaborative platforms. Again, this is something that has been enabled by the internet. With things like virtual research environments, collaborative writing platforms, something as simple as Google Drive or Office 365, reference management and discovery, where references can be shared across various labs around the world through maybe Mendeley or so on. And then you have the, obviously, academic social networks. And then what we're also seeing to begin to happen is open peer review, metrics and evaluation. So traditionally, peer review was conducted in a very blind environment because it was trying to account for social bias. So if a researcher with a high impact or had a very high profile was publishing, then it might bias the researchers to give him a good review. Whereas open peer review, if there's open identities, if the subjects and the reviewers know each other, then in theory those biases should be discounted for. So there's pros and cons around open peer review, but it does offer opportunities to people to get credit for doing peer review on scientific publication, but also it allows us to see the open reports of that peer review. And Mick will talk later about next generation metrics and how we can move towards open metrics. So as you know, a lot of the research metrics, quantitative research metrics, are bound up by proprietary databases and are also, I suppose, very focused on journal metrics. But and it is very important to accelerate open science if we can move away from this prestige economy associated with journals. And open science policies, skip through these very quickly, the last few slides, sorry. So open science policies, obviously they're the strategies and actions aimed at promoting open science principles and at acknowledging open science practices. Obviously they are generally instigated by research performing institutions, research funders, so, and maybe the institutions you work in. So in UCC we have an open access policy, an intellectual property policy, a research data management policy, and we're also informed by the national policy statement on ensuring research integrity. So these all feed into the behaviours of researchers and in so doing improve the chances of open science succeeding. And then citizen science is where us all non-researchers can get involved. It's the involvement of non-academic public in the process of scientific research. And you're probably very familiar with this idea of citizen science from projects like the Galaxy Zoo, where there are 150 participants classified galaxies. But also in Ireland we have the National Biodiversity Data Centre, which collects biodiversity data for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So from the comfort of your kitchen you can start logging what birds you're seeing in your garden, and it builds up a bigger biodiversity profile for the country. Open educational resources. So this is where I reveal where all of my source material came from. So all of the material I've used today has come from the Open Science Training Handbook. It's an open educational resource. It is licensed Creative Commons. I don't know if you can see, this is where it explains what the license is and what you're allowed to do. So I can reuse everything in the book and all of the images, and and I don't have to ask for permission. So obviously that was fantastic for me. I hope you're finding it equally fantastic. But it's just a very, I think it's a fantastic illustration of how useful it is. So if you're going out and trying to promote open science at your institution, you have this trainer's handbook readily made with examples, learning objectives, misconceptions, frequently asked questions, and you can use those to spread the word about open science. And I suppose also just to give, if you want to find out more about open educational resources, the Connell Teaching and Learning Seminar this year is going to be all about open educational resources. And finally, just open advocacy, where you're trying to advocate for the movement of open science at various levels to stakeholders. And just a final word on how do libraries fit into this whole open science area. So again, luckily don't have to think too hard, because the Association of European Research Libraries published a roadmap to open science in 2018, and they call for libraries to advocate for open science locally and internationally, to support open science through tools and services, and to expand the impact of our work through collaboration and partnerships. And I hope when you're listening to my colleagues, co-speakers later, you'll see how that is very much in train, that libraries are very much involved in open science in their institutions. So thanks very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Michael O'Connor from Queen's University Belfast. So the applause is for you, Michael. Come on.